Oftentimes in the classroom, I will have students respond to each of the following statements by indicating whether they highly disagree, whether they're ambivalent, or whether they highly agree. I choose ambivalent, in the middle instead of the word neutral. Neutral might imply that you don't care or that you don't have a dog in the fight, so to speak. You really don't have any skin in the game or any stakes in the matter. Ambivalent, a little bit different, means that we can kind of see the issue, or in this case, interpret the statement from different sides. We can see different, and maybe not just see, but understand different perspectives, or maybe see the logic in various angles. So I'll have students indicate whether they agree, disagree, or are ambivalent in response to the following statement. If you want to do this, on a sheet of paper or just in your mind, you can pause this video right now and respond to each of these 5 statements. Moving ahead, though, maybe you choose to pause, maybe you do not. What you'll see is that people are going to respond to these statements in different ways. For some of you, you might respond to each of these 5 statements, and then at the end, see that you have many highly agrees. Maybe you have at least 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 highly agrees. Or maybe some of you highly disagree to a majority of these statements. You look down your sheet of paper, or, you think back to how you answered, and you've got, several highly disagrees. Maybe some of you are ambivalent, again, meaning that you can see both sides or multiple sides of the issue. I do this simply to illustrate, at this early stage of introducing you to the sociological study of race and ethnicity, I do so to illustrate that people attach different degrees of significance to this. People have different experiences with race and ethnicity, and therefore they have internalized, its meaning and what it means to them in unequal manners. But if you're someone who agrees, or highly agrees to several of these statements, your views on race and ethnicity tend to be a little bit more absolute, we could say. You believe that race and ethnicity is pretty important, meaning that it's important in how you identify yourself. It's important because people can, identify you perhaps based on your race and ethnicity. If you indicate that you highly agree to statement 2, that means that you believe your race and ethnicity is known just, by, when people first look at you. You might highly agree that race or ethnicity plays a substantial role in shaping the opportunities that you either have or do not have in life, kind of in statement number 5 there. But, if you highly disagree with these statements, you have you have a much less absolute view on race and ethnicity. You believe that it's not that important, or that it does not shape your identity, or does not shape the way people view you, does not shape the opportunities or advantages that you have or do not have. So people will attach different degrees of significance and different meanings to race and ethnicity. You just take a look at these different images here. Up on top, toward the left, you see Race, the Power of an Illusion. That was the title of a documentary that was released in the early 2000s. When we say race, the power of an illusion, well, an illusion is really an idea. So the takeaway here is that race might just be an idea. Maybe it's not. Maybe perhaps it's not something that's real. Perhaps it is something that exists only in the mind. Then if you look at the image on the upper right, you see a question asked, what race do you identify yourself as? And the respondent has crossed out all of the answer choices and written in human. We might say that, this is a expression of opposition to having to identify with a race or ethnicity. Perhaps this respondent feels that race and ethnicity is not that important. Perhaps this respondent feels that race and ethnicity is really just that these categories of race or ethnicity are really just a way to divide people. By emphasizing that they're a part of the human race, this respondent is perhaps saying that, they're perhaps emphasizing what they have in common with other people rather than what sets them apart. Then if you look at that image on the bottom left, you see what appears to be a female, and the image is, pixelated in such a way that this woman's race or ethnicity, uh, could be subject to argument or subject to debate. The race or ethnicity that we might view her as, well, it really depends on which part of that image we look at, right? Different facial features appear differently depending on the pixelation of the image. So maybe, looking at that image, we could say that race is kind of in the eye of the beholder, as some people say. Maybe race is all a matter of perception. Perhaps it's all a matter of what people look at or what they choose to look at. Then at the bottom right, you see a screenshot from an NBC News interview with Rachel Dolezal. Rachel Dolezal, for those of you who might not be familiar, she was at the center of some controversy several years ago because she was the uh, chairperson for the Spokane, Washington chapter of the NAACP. NAACP stands for National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It is a organization that advocates for the rights, opportunities, equitable treatment of racial and ethnic minorities. Historically, it's been focused toward African Americans, but over time, that they advocate for, all people of color. So she is leading this local chapter of the NAACP, a pro-African American civil rights organization, but her parents revealed to local news, this is in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State, her parents came forward and said, she is not African American. She is not Black. She is not what she's been identifying herself as. Rachel Dolezal, in her position of leadership for this uh, civil rights organization, for this pro Black organization, had identified, she did identify, and she still does to this day identify as Black. But her parents came forward to local media and said that, well, we are not African American. To our knowledge, we do not have, Black ancestry. But there you see her being quoted, her saying in the interview, I definitely am not white. So we take all these images together and we might say, okay, race, well, maybe it's just an idea. Maybe it's something that divides us more than it unites us. Maybe people pay too much attention to it. Maybe it's all a matter of perception. Perhaps it's all a matter of, what features we choose to look at, on another person. And perhaps it's all a matter of identity. Perhaps race and ethnicity are all a matter of what we choose to identify as. We can harbor all of those views. We can believe that race is just a matter of perception or all a matter of how someone chooses to identify. We might believe that race is just an idea. But if we do that, we are going to have to at some point reconcile various sources of racial and ethnic inequality. You see just a few examples here, median net worth by race. If you take a look at the numbers there, you see that the white household in the United States on average has almost 18 times more wealth. So that's the value of someone's asset, the value of, in this case, a household's assets. Almost 18 times as much wealth as the median Black household. So you see substantial inequality in terms of wealth by household. Over there, if you look at the pie charts on the right, bias motivation categories for victims of single bias incidents. This is in the year 2020. Really what we're talking about here is hate crimes. If you look at the basis for victimhood here, you see that race and ethnicity constitutes for over 61% of all hate crimes. That's going to be the victim's race or ethnicity. So, the reason why this offense took place was because of the victim's race or ethnicity. That's more than 3 times the second highest category, which is going to be the victim's sexual orientation. And then you see religion at just over 13%. So, the victim's race or ethnicity is, by far the greatest reason for why these hate crimes are occurring. Then below that, you see some data regarding discipline within public schools. You see the rates of suspension, rates of expulsion, rates of transfer, rates of restraints that are used, rates of behavioral referrals, rates of arrests, comparing Black students to white students. On the left, you have females, and then on the right, you have males. And you see, no matter which category we're looking at, no matter whether we're talking about females or males, the rate of Black suspensions far surpassing that of white, or not just suspensions, but the rate of, discipline for Black students far surpassing that for white students. And this is just, 3 things that I'm, pointing out here. We're looking at wealth, we're looking at uh, hate crimes, and then we're looking at school discipline. We could also look at, say, you know, likelihood of graduating college, likelihood of not having health insurance. We're going to see racial and ethnic inequality across a number of categories. So we can say things like, well, race doesn't really matter that much to me, or it's not that important. People make too much out of it. Maybe it's all a matter of perception. Maybe it's all a matter of identity. And yeah, okay, we might, say that. That's, I'm not going to tell people what to believe, but we do see numerous examples of racial and ethnic inequality. Before we go any further, let's just clarify some key terms. When we talk about race, we're talking about a human constructed category of individuals with similar physical features that have come to be socially significant. So the physical features that we're referring to, well, of course, it's going to be skin color, hair texture. If someone grows their hair out, what does it do? Does it hang down? Does it, extend outward or upward? The shape of the skin by someone's eyes, the curvature of certain facial features. So it's just these physical features that have come to be socially significant when we talk about race. Never in all my life have I heard someone say, I wonder what race or what race someone is, or I wonder what racial background that person has. I wish I could see their kneecap, or if only I could see an x-ray of their elbow, or, their lungs, whatever the case might be. No, that's ridiculous. It sounds stupid. When we talk about race, we're talking about physical features that are pertinent to race. A racial group, therefore, is going to be a group that is set apart from others because of physical differences that, once again, have taken on a social significance. Ethnicity, in contrast, is not about physical features. No, ethnicity is about culture. Things such as the language that is spoken, their religious beliefs, their beliefs about things other than religion, the foods they eat, the way they dress. So ethnicity is going to be a human constructed social identity related to ancestry and or distinct cultural practices. When we talk about ancestry, we're talking about the part of the world that someone comes from, the part of the world that someone traces their lineage to. An ethnic group is a group that is set apart or distinct from others because of their ancestry or cultural practices. A minority group, socially speaking, so a social minority, is going to be a group whose members have less power or control over their lives relative to what we would call a dominant or a majority group. Now, that's how we look at a social minority. If you're a math major or if you're into statistics, a statistical minority is going to be any group that constitutes less than 50% of the population. But, sometimes we have groups that do constitute less than 50% of the population. So they are a statistical minority, but they are not a social minority. We might have a group that constitutes just 20% of the population, but they might be overrepresented in government. They might be overrepresented represented in colleges and universities. That's a statistical minority, but it's not a social minority.